Hello everybody, my name is Justin and I'm from languagehand.com. I'm a teacher and teacher trainer. I work in London in the Wimbledon School of English at the moment, and I also run languagehand.com. So this is my EFL talk on top-down processing, one of my favorite subjects, as one of my specialities happens to be the brain and how the brain comprehends language. So without further ado, let me take you through it. So top-down processing, what is it exactly? As you can see in my slide, I've got a jigsaw puzzle. And this is the best analogy to understand top-down processing. The big picture versus the little bitty pieces. And basically, it's this idea that our brains can focus in on one particular piece, or our brains would actually need to balance and manage multiple pieces at one time, and therefore access metacognitive things like working memory. But if the words like metacognition and metacognitive processes is a little bit scary for you, do not worry about it. I'm here to make it very simple, very easy. So, a quick example perhaps. All right, so in the first picture, I've got a suitcase. Imagine someone traveling. Now, this is a typical context for a lot of teachers nowadays to actually use present perfect and to communicate present perfect. So if we look at the picture, we can see various stickers, and from this we can use the language, which is, oh, he has been to this place. He has been to that place. Now, this is actually one that came out of my CELTA training as well. This is going to be bottom up, where you teach your students one structure at a time, and you ask them to become proficient in that one structure. Now, this is not a bad thing, but you're isolating a structure, and therefore your students are getting a little bit lazy with using all of their structures and balancing them together. Now, the second example is a typical letter, writing a letter. And in letter writing, as I'm sure you've experienced, you have to use multiple grammatical structures to communicate your meaning. For example, hi, I'm sorry I haven't written to you in a long time. I have been very busy, and therefore we are using two present perfects already. And then you would say, I'm writing to tell you about, and there's your present continuous. So the idea is that the big picture, the big job, the big function of letter writing actually means that we have to utilize and manage all of these different grammatical structures and balance them in the correct place in an appropriate order. So this brings us to the question, why do it? And if you haven't looked at this from the example yet, if you haven't understood it yet from the example, I'm sure you can get it now if I say to you that top-down processing is more typical in real life and much more functional for your students. When you isolate something, it becomes clean. It almost becomes a little bit cold, like you're a scientist in a laboratory. But rather, top-down processing allows you to mix things together and see how they work in real life. And it's this idea that our brain actually cannot necessarily understand something by itself, but it understands things in relation to others. So how do you know if something's valuable unless other people also consider it valuable? How do you know if a word is rude if no one reacts to it? But if somebody reacts to it, we know it's rude. So it's the idea of giving value to something according to how it's perceived in its environment. Okay, so maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's kick in the idea of metacognitive processing. So whenever we create language, it's quite stressful for the mind and we get tired. And a lot of our students say that they want to improve their speaking, and it's this idea that they constantly translate. Now, translation is one of the brain's kind of skills, and it gets better at this and more automatic. A good example of this is the how are you, nice to meet you. Students don't need to translate these phrases anymore. They've made them automatic. So that is one example of a metacognitive process, which is automaticity. Okay, so there are other things are, for example, balancing. So if you teach your students, oh, I haven't done this yet. I haven't done my yoga yet. I haven't done my homework yet. You're asking them to substitute one thing into an entire sentence. But if you're asking them to change sentences, but one structure and multiple sentence parts, then they get better at balancing and managing these things. And therefore, the bigger you go, the more hard work it is in the beginning, but actually the better it is for them in the long run. So our end goal is competency in real life scenarios. And I've used this for Cambridge exams as well as just general English classes, conversation classes. So let me show you how I do it. So the first thing is every time we study a word, a phrase, or a piece of grammar, a sentence structure, I come up with at least 3 real life contexts. And I always ask myself the question, would I say this? So a big grammatical structure that I used with my students was, I do this action far less now than I did when I was younger. And I thought to myself, why would I ever say this? And I thought, well, perhaps if I'm talking about a good habit. So for example, I exercise far less now than I did when I was younger. Or I could say, I exercise far more now than I did when I was younger. So a good change. Then I talked about a bad habit. I eat far less chocolate now than I did when I was younger. Or perhaps I eat far more chocolate now than I did when I was younger. And students very quickly get to grips with this idea if they think, well, I'm communicating good habits or bad habits. And that's quite a real context as well. What's wrong with you today? I'm not feeling very well. Why? Because I just ate a lot of chocolate. Well, what's the problem? Well, I eat far less chocolate now than I did when I was younger, but sometimes I slip. And giving students this type of example is very good. The last one, I could say, I study far less now than I did when I was younger. And something like cycling through contexts like good habits, bad habits, and then just general life gives students a very clear picture of how to use the grammar in their life. Another example is to cycle through the grammar. For example, past tenses versus present tenses versus future tenses. So I do this now far more than I did when I was younger. So we're comparing 2 tenses. So the only way that we can go is to say, I will do it far more than I do it now. Okay, so we're cycling through 2 different grammatical structures and just asking your students to cycle through grammar. Even if it's very difficult, we can do the negative. I don't blah blah now compared to I did when I was younger. So this one's a little bit tricky. So you have to try to use your own intuition as to what works and what doesn't work. Some grammatical structures don't work in the negative. Some grammatical structures change their meaning in the negative. So cycle through the grammar, questions, negatives, affirmatives, past, present, future, simple, continuous, perfect, simple. Getting your students to balance these types of structures, very, very good for their brains. The next one, of course, is just cycling through vocabulary. So staying with the context of, let's say, food, and you get them to cycle through it. So I cook far less now than I did when I was younger. The next vocabulary after that, you could say eat. And you could say, I diet far less now than I did when I was younger. And something like this allows students to stay in one topic, but explore that topic with all their specific vocabulary as well. It's quite easy, really. So the last thing to focus on is that their performance with regard to their brain is also related to their memory. So the first job is they need to be able to remember the words. And if they don't, you will see it in their eyes. They need to be able to then focus on the pronunciation to make sure that they're sounding correct with their vocabulary pronunciation, their groups of words, their intonation, the sentence stress, etc. And then finally, the body and how they use the hands and the face to complement what they're saying. So that's it from me. Thank you very much. If you want to hear more from me, if you want to contact me with any of your questions, please reach me at justin@languagehand.com or come and visit me at LanguageHand. And thank you very much.